Good evening, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another edition of Talking Point. My name is Faraz Patel. I'll be in your company for the next 45 to 50 minutes. We're coming to you live from our studios in Johannesburg. We are on channel 347 on DSTV on Hilaal TV. Well, we all know about the Steinhoff scandal that happened 5 years ago, one of the largest corporate scandals that had happened in South Africa. Just last week, the CEO of Steinhoff, Mr. Marcus Jooste, had his assets seized by the South African Reserve Bank. This was one step into, of course, holding Mr. Jooste accountable for what had happened, really, in what is regarded as a huge scandal in terms of the corporate sector here in South Africa. Now, my guest today is a man that, of course, chaired Steinhoff. Obviously, just right after the scandal had happened, had resigned from the conglomerate. But he's also a man that has 50 years experience in building some of the biggest retailers in South Africa. We talk of Pepco, we talk of Shoprite, Checkers, and the list goes on. I'd like to introduce, and it gives me the great honor in welcoming Dr. Christo Wiese. Dr. Wiese, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for us. It's a pleasure.
No, it's an absolute pleasure from our side. Now, Dr. Wiese, before we talk of Steinhoff, 50 years being in business, being a philanthropist, being an entrepreneur, the list goes on. What keeps you motivated to keep on doing this? You know, when you wake up every day, what is the one thing you tell yourself that, you know what, today I'm going to go ahead and just keep on building these brands and enhancing these brands that I've built over these years?
Well, for us, it's essentially because I enjoy it. I love working with people. I love seeing businesses grow. But I also enjoy particularly seeing people grow in businesses. And, I live by the adage that the only time to retire is 30 seconds before you give your last breath or take your last breath.
And
That's the right time.
Yeah, no, I mean,
maybe stupid, but
yeah, please do continue, Dr. Wiese.
Yeah, I said maybe stupid, but that's what works for me.
No, 100%. And I think, a businessman of your stature, of course, keeps on going, keeps on inspiring. But we are going to touch on your philanthropy and, of course, how you've, built up these businesses over the years. Dr. Wiese, we saw last week, of course, Mr. Marcus Jooste was, of course, the CEO of Steinhoff, having his assets seized by the South African Reserve Bank. Let's cast our mind back to 2017 when all of this had happened. Sitting there with your board of directors, how could this have happened? We have Marcus Jooste, who's one of the brightest accountants in South Africa, a man who's, of course, been there at the height of Steinhoff, seeing the shares rise, and just all of a sudden this happening. How did he come to this?
Well, it came to that disastrous outcome for us because people within Steinhoff started defrauding the company, in my view, more than 15 years ago, and slowly constructed this massive fraud, did it extremely cleverly, and that is inter alia proven by the fact that the prosecuting authorities, both here and abroad, are having great difficulty in bringing the perpetrators to trial. I think the move by the Reserve Bank, the so-called Al Capone option, is a brilliant move, and certainly, hopefully, things will now start unraveling. I always make the point for us that for one to understand just how cleverly this fraud had been constructed over so many years, you have to understand that the fraudsters managed to get through all the gatekeepers, getting through the internal auditors, getting through the various sets of auditors, because there were component auditors, there were statutory auditors, being Deloitte, one of the largest auditing firms in the world, getting through all the regulators, all the banks, all the fund managers, and but primarily the bond buyers. I mean, these are people that look very, very carefully at companies' financial statements, and they got through all those gatekeepers, including the board of Steinhoff over the years. The people who served on the boards of Steinhoff were some of the most eminent business people in South Africa. And I've often made the point that Steinhoff was the only company of which I was aware that had 3 people on its audit committee who were not just auditors, they were professors of auditing, and they held doctorates in accounting. That gives you some idea.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the thing, isn't it, Dr. Wiese? You've got all the gatekeeping. I mean, we're talking of Steinhoff. It's one of the largest conglomerates, not just here, but also overseas. It trades on so many stock exchanges, and yet this was able to happen. As a director and, of course, as a chairperson at the time, how did you feel at first when, of course, the reports came out? And then, of course, as a chairperson and / director, you see these, of course, the statements, the audits coming out. What is your first reaction at that time, seeing what had happened and all this money that had been invested, including yours? And I'm going to touch on, of course, the money that you had lost, all those years, all those investments that you put in. So you're sitting there and you're asking yourself, how did this happen?
Well, yeah, obviously, I mean, the first thing is disbelief. One simply cannot believe that this calamity could have been created. And I just need to point out, Faraz, because again, that's something that people don't take sufficiently notice of. In 2015, just prior to the listing of the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, there was a raid on Steinhoff's offices in Germany by the German tax authorities. Now, of course, that was a tremendous shock to the board of Steinhoff, and the board then decided to appoint one of the largest forensic investigating firms in Germany. Very highly rated, very prestigious firm, consisting of 100 or 150 lawyers, accountants, corporate governance people, with a brief to investigate every single allegation made by the German authorities. And over the 5-year period from that date, no, not the 5-year period, it was a 2-year period, from 2015 to 2017, until the last day, that firm called FGS reported to the board of Steinhoff that there was nothing wrong. There were no irregularities, as it was called. There was no fraud. There was no tax contraventions. Until the very last day, that was the report. So you can imagine my shock when I, having been in the chair for 4 meetings only, was approached 3 days before the time, or 4 days before the time, by the auditors to say that they suspect massive fraud.
Dr. Wiese, we go December 8th. We're closing, of course, stock exchanges closes on that Friday. The shares are trading on Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken, it's the 5th of December, 46.25 Rand per share at that time.
Yeah.
And then the Friday, it goes to 6 Rand. You've, of course, invested heavily in there. You'll be able to obviously tell us, at the time it's 20%, maybe you can correct me, of the amount of shareholding that you have. You lose so much money.
Sorry, Faraz,
yes.
On your figures, sorry, there's something wrong with the internet. You keep disappearing.
Okay.
Can you
Yeah,
hear me?
okay. Let me, I was repeating your shareholding at the time at Steinhoff, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, was sitting at 20%, before obviously you had...
in round numbers, Faraz, I owned 1 billion shares.
Yes.
You can do the math.
Yes.
If it dropped from 46 to 6, that means that in those 2 days I lost 40 billion rand.
You lose that money, Dr. Wiese. It must hurt, doesn't it? Because you've invested so much into a company. And I'm going to ask you of your vision after the break, what you had along with all the board of directors for Steinhoff. But it must hurt, mustn't it, knowing that you've lost all this money to a man who had been seen as such an accounting genius?
Sorry, Faraz, you do break up.
Okay.
The internet connection here.
My question is just, how did you feel at the time knowing that you had lost all that billions in a company that you had not just monetary wise, but emotionally wise also, you had invested all of that money?
No, I felt, terrible. You can imagine what one feels like. When I appeared in Parliament, I explained that what had been stolen from me was the work of 50 years, my work and the work of thousands of my colleagues who built up Pepkor.
Yeah, well, we are going to...
So you can what one feels like.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I mean, knowing that you had the billion shares, losing all of those billions, one can only imagine, I think the emotional and, of course, monetary heartbreak that one would feel at that very moment. But after this break, we will continue the conversation with Dr. Christo Wiese, of course, a man that has been involved in so many retailers in South Africa, and, of course, the former chairperson of Steinhoff. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to Talking Point. My name is Faraz Patel. I'm in conversation with Dr. Christo Wiese. Dr. Wiese, we saw last week Mr. Marcus Uister's assets being, of course, seized by the South African Reserve Bank. Would you say the wheels of justice are turning, even if it's slow, but we're getting somewhere?
I think undoubtedly that is the case for us. As I explained, in this very complicated matter, it is not surprising that it has taken a long time. I'm not suggesting it should have taken 5 years, but having regard to the complexity, one has sympathy for the time it's taken, but at last the wheels are turning.
Dr. Wiese, many would say that, in inverted commas, he was sort of like a protege to yourself. Of course, he was sitting as the CEO, you sitting as the chairperson, and you see this man obviously do what he had done. If you were to see Mr. Marcus Uister now, what would you tell him? What would you ask him if you had to ever meet him?
No, well, I mean, the first question I would ask him, I imagine it's the only question I would ask him, was to ask him why he did it. What was he trying to achieve? Because the irony is, in my case, that from me and my fellow shareholders in Pepkor, altogether 60 billion rand was stolen. And to the best of my knowledge, Mr. Uister doesn't have a penny of that money. The business today belongs to the banks and the hedge funds who lent Steinhoff money long before Steinhoff acquired Pepkor. So what was the purpose of it all? What did he hope to achieve?
And added to that, obviously, you've got the Public Investment Corporation who also put money in there. And of course, this is money that's supposed to be for the retirement of so many South African workers also.
Yeah, but for us, obviously one feels very sorry for those people, pensioners who lost money. But there were also many colleagues of Uister who worked with him together, shoulder to shoulder, in many instances for 20 years, who lost everything they had, because everything they had was invested in the business. So the devastation that was caused by this fraud, in my case, it's an enormous amount of money, the reputational risk, but there are other people that were virtually destroyed. And the damage to the country, to our image, etc., it's just, beyond belief.
yeah, one can only imagine that, because we're talking of, obviously, Steinhoff International, and just what a massive conglomerate it was, not just from a South African perspective, but also overseas. And that comes to the next question, Dr. Wiese, the vision of Steinhoff. And you've got all of these, these retailers under Steinhoff. Just your vision when you, of course, enter the board and you chaired the board. What was the vision of Steinhoff, firstly from a short-term perspective and then from a long-term perspective?
Well, the vision was a very simple one. It was to create what we liked to call at that stage an African champion, to be amongst the biggest retailers in the world, to use all the synergistic benefits that the large group offered, and to build something that would be great for South Africa and for South Africans. That was the simple vision.
Dr. Wiese, white-collar crime, of course, one could term what had happened at Steinhoff as being one of those also. But as you sit as a businessman with 50 years of experience, chairing so many boards, how difficult is it for board of directors to obviously be the anti-white-collar crime band or anti-white-collar crime crusaders in making sure that when you sit as board of directors, when you present when the financials get presented to yourself, that everything is clean? As a board, as somebody who has chaired boards, how do you fight white-collar crime? And what is your advice, obviously, to the rest of other board of directors in fighting this, knowing that there's a possibility that it can happen to any conglomerate?
It can happen to any business, Faraz. I was perhaps in the fortunate position that I was part of PEP and ShopRite right at the beginning. So I was involved building it shop by shop. So you get to know it very intimately, and you employ people that you have trust in, and you hope they trust in you. I've often told people that I've never attended an audit committee meeting in my life because I'm not an accountant. I relied on my colleagues, and for 50 years for me, it worked spectacularly well until I ran into Mr. Jooste.
And due diligence, continue please, Dr. Wiese. Dr. Wiese, you can continue.
Yeah, to get to your question, how does one prevent it? I've often said to people, sure, you can blame the non-executive directors on the board, one of which I happen to be in Steinhoff, but put yourself in the position of a director who gets audited accounts from several layers of auditors that have gone through a very competent audit committee, as it was perceived at the time. Must that non-executive director now say, no, wait a minute, these auditors who employ hundreds of very qualified people, they don't know what they're doing. I should go and do the audit myself. It's just ridiculous. So what is the consequence of that? It means that there is no foolproof way of preventing this kind of fraud. I mean, Steinhoff was barely cold when Tonga Hewlett happened.
Yes.
And barely cold in Europe when that Wirecard fraud happened. These things happen all the time. And my only conclusion is that if you have a CEO who is a crook, and normally a clever crook, otherwise he wouldn't have been CEO, then you have a huge problem on your hands. I personally, people have asked me the question, what can be done to stop it? Well, why do the mighty Americans, they couldn't see Madoff and they couldn't see Enron with all their regulatory authorities, with all their auditors. I mean, Enron destroyed Arthur Andersen.
Yes.
Then I think the largest auditing firm in the world. So the simple answer is, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those where it just catches you unaware, and then you have to have that sort of knee-jerk reaction to what happens. But Dr. Wiese, due diligence, that is something that, of course, board of directors can try and say, you know what, we can find a way to make sure that we do not have the company sinking to lower heights, as one can call it that way. So due diligence again in large corporates, it's important, isn't it, in making sure that the company is there trading well, but most importantly, trading the way the stock exchange wants companies to be traded.
Yeah, well, I mean, that is essentially the job of management and of a board of directors. Management are the people who do the day-to-day pushing and shoving. The board of directors there to oversee, to give strategic direction, etc., etc. But unless you really go into the business, work in a shop, for instance, yourself, which was my advantage in PEP and ShopRite, I knew those businesses intimately. So I would have seen that, in some of the returns, something is wrong. I did not know the businesses in Steinhoff that intimately when I went into it, but by that time it was a well-established company, nearly 20 years old. And again, I point out to people that Steinhoff had a market capitalization of 100 billion rand when I sold Pepkor to Steinhoff. So it had been through the mill. I mean, it was a massive company by South African standards. So one assumes that things are all right. Now, of course, subsequently, there were many geniuses who said, no, but they knew Steinhoff was a crooked setup. It was a criminal conspiracy. And there were people who held that view, but there were 100 billion rands of other people who put their money in.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I mean that I guess just highlights, of course, the importance of due diligence and everything being proper, and it just takes one CEO to go ahead and, of course, change all of that and change the perception of the company. But after the break, we're not going to be delving on the serious stuff of Steinhoff. We're going to be talking philanthropy of Dr. Wiese and his 50 years in retailing and how he has built his businesses to be these major conglomerates within South Africa and, of course, them trading outside of the country. Do stay tuned to Talking Point. Welcome back to Talking Point. Now, the names of ShopRite, PEP, and so many other retailers have a significant cultural and historical significance within South Africa. It is a organization that not just creates jobs, but allows people to have clothing on themselves and, of course, allows them to shop for the basic needs that every South African truly deserves. And the one man, of course, responsible for creating these conglomerates, these retail stores, is, of course, none other than Dr. Christo Wiese, who is still my guest here on Talking Point. Dr. Wiese, you start these businesses. When you look back at it, maybe give the viewers an idea of just how it was difficult or easy to have started something like this at a time where, it had become something new in the eyes of South Africans.
Yeah, for us, there are several aspects to the answer to that question. First of all, one of our most successful business people in South Africa, at the end of his career, said that had he known just how difficult, how hard it would be, he would never have started. Yet, when he got to the end of his career and he built a mighty empire, he marveled at how easy it was. And I mean, that has been my experience as well. It was very, very tough when we started. We had very little money, and it was really hard going. But when you get to the end of it, you say, well, it really wasn't that difficult after all. Secondly, people go into business and for a lot of reasons. The man in the street often thinks it's only to make money. But money, once you've made a certain amount, has a marginal value. But there are other satisfactions to be derived from building businesses. You pointed out a business like PEP made it possible for poor people, people on low budgets, to clothe themselves and their families decently. Now, what that does to a person's dignity is indescribable. Equally, ShopRite, they occasionally publish the numbers. ShopRite subsidizes the South African consumers to the extent of billions of rands per year. Thirdly, at the height of my career, there were 300,000 people working in our businesses, working with me. And their jobs changed their lives. I've seen people starting as a shop assistant in these businesses, rising to very high positions, being able to put their children through university, and many, many other achievements. And that gives far greater satisfaction than the next million that the entrepreneur makes or doesn't make.
Dr. Wiese, the beauty of South Africa and the beauty of the market, it allows for, of course, competition. Besides ShopRite and Checkers, you've got OK Bazaars, you've got Pick n Pay. Just how, the beauty of the competition, but also trying to challenge them, because like yourself, Mr. Ackerman of Pick n Pay would have had the same vision of you, of course. And those who, of course, are behind OK Bazaars would have had the same vision as you.
Yeah.
Competition, and you as a founder and chairperson of these conglomerates, how do you tackle the competition in terms of pricing of the basic commodities, but also advertising and marketing also to make sure that that very same customer that used to come to ShopRite will be there the following day?
Yeah, well, there's an old American saying, I can't remember who said it, that there are only two things that are certain in life. No, three things. Number one is death. That is certain.
Definitely.
Number two is taxation.
Yes, definitely.
And number three is competition. Those are the only three things certain in life. So if you go into business, you know that there is competition. How do you meet the competition? You understand that the business is about serving the customer. Everything that ShopRite does, and they publish it regularly, is to say that everything they do is designed to make life better for their customers, saving them money, it's giving them a choice, etc., etc. And if you just do that better than the next guy, then competition is to be welcomed and not to be feared.
Dr. Wiese, your philanthropy, and when you look at the success of your businesses, and I want to touch on obviously PEP and ShopRite Checkers, because those are stores that you can find, be it in the malls in Sandton or Cornell Walk or Waterfront, to places in the townships like Khayelitsha, Soweto's, and so many other places. You can find it everywhere. 50 years on, when you look at it, I mean, how much of joy does it bring you knowing that you've not just reached out to all these communities, but you've also allowed for there to be employment, and of course, and just making a difference to the man on the street or the woman on the street who can go ahead and have the basic necessities as enshrined in our Constitution?
That is, if I have to say what has given me the greatest satisfaction in my career, That's what gave me the greatest satisfaction. To see that these businesses, which were built with thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of colleagues, made a difference in the lives of millions of South Africans.
And that's the most important aspect, especially now with a challenging economy. Yeah, Mr. Wiese, do you want to add more to that?
No, I'm just saying that absolutely right.
And I couldn't disagree with you on that any further, because that's the most important thing, allowing there to be employment, especially in an economy where the figures of unemployment are so high. Coming after the break, we wrap up the discussion with Dr. Wiese. We'll be talking the challenges of the South African economy, how retailers like Shoprite and Pep can play their role in trying to alleviate something or some way in unemployment, and just his advice, the 50-year experienced Dr. Wiese's advice to any young entrepreneur out there. Do stay tuned to Talking Point. Welcome back to Talking Point. We're in the final few minutes of what has been an amazing discussion with Dr. Christo Wiese. Dr. Wiese, the South African economy, there are tremendous challenges that have been presented to it. Today's midterm budget speech, of course, few pros, few cons to it. Just from your point of view, how do we tackle the current situation of the South African economy, given so many challenges, one especially the energy crisis?
Yeah, for us, can I start off by saying General Smuts, the erstwhile Prime Minister of South Africa, described South Africa as that peculiar country where things are never as good as it should be, but never as bad as it could be.
Yes.
But South Africa is the most wonderful country in the world. I mean, we should have an absolutely flourishing economy. We've got everything in our favor, except one. We followed this misguided policies. Apartheid was a bad dream, a misguided policy, misguided approach. I'm afraid until we finally learn in South Africa that it is not the politicians in the first instance who determine the state of the economy, but the markets. We've seen it now with Prime Minister Truss in England.
Yes.
He came with some misguided policies, and the markets immediately punished the British economy. The sadness is that it's the man in the street who bears the brunt. It falls on him. His mortgage rates going up. His food basket's price goes up. His petrol goes up. He is the man who suffers. And in our country, we have on top of that, the tragedy of enormous unemployment. And you know, I don't pretend that there are silver bullets to cure all the problems, but I know that there are a few things that can be done virtually with the stroke of a pen that can improve the lives of millions of South Africans. But we stick to, you know, for years, when we had our energy problem, the government would not concede for the private sector to get involved in supplying energy. Our train services, which are in an absolute shambles, our once proud airline, South African Airways, gone to the wall, losing thousands of jobs. And why? Because government believes that a government can run an economy and can create jobs. I mean, by now, every person with half a brain in the world should know that a government cannot create a single job. Jobs are created by the private sector.
Yes.
So the lesson is simple. But sooner or later, people learn the lesson, unfortunately, with lots of pain.
Yeah, and of course, the elections, which are 2 years' time, allows for democracy in this country and for that to happen. Dr. Wiese, I've just got two questions before we conclude the show. The future of retailers, we've seen, obviously, when we look 50 years back, there wasn't anything called online shopping, and online shopping has boomed in the last, 15 years. Uh, what is the challenges now for retailers vis-a-vis the online the online shopping that has just happened right now, given that we've just come from a pandemic which allowed for online shopping to happen? I know obviously ShopRite and Checkers had launched the 66 the 66 the sort of program which allowed for there to be delivery. But when as a traditional shopper, you still want to go into the shop and do the shopping. Is the future of retailers still blossoming, even if we have the online economy?
I think so, undoubtedly. And you see it. I mean, you see smart retailers like ShopRite taking note of how the world has changed and meeting the challenge with 60/60, inter alia,
Yes.
and many other initiatives. That's just the nature of smart, hardworking business people. They don't, just stand where they used to be and die in the process. They change with the times and they grab the challenges. And that is exactly what ShopRite has done, Checkers has done, and will continue to do. There will be fantastic initiatives coming out of that group in the next few years because it's got a wonderful management team who live in the real world and in the modern world.
And I think that's important, having the presence of the past and also that of the present and the future. Dr. Wiese, to wrap up the conversation, entrepreneurs, there's so many South Africans who want to be the next Dr. Wiese or, so many other, great entrepreneurs that this country has produced. Some of them sometimes don't have the backing, the financial backing, and they need to go through various agencies to go ahead and get that funding. As somebody who has chaired so many boards, as somebody who has got the 5 decades of being an entrepreneur, what is your advice to a South African entrepreneur who wants to make an impact in the economy of our country?
For us, over the years, I've been asked that question so many times. And my answer was always twofold. First of all, small business people look at so-called big business people and say to themselves, hell, that guy must have had a blueprint. And I don't have a blueprint. So how am I going to make it? Forgetting that all big businesses all over the world have one thing in common. They all started as small businesses. Every single one of them. They all faced the same challenges. And then when they ask me, but what is the magic word? Very easy. It's a 4-letter word. It's spelled WORK. Work. If you work, you will make it.
Definitely. I don't think you could have termed it any better, Dr. Wiese. Work, and of course, you will see the results at the end of the day. Dr. Wiese, I wish we had more time to speak on so many aspects, but we'd like to say thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. And, may you be around to continue to inspire future entrepreneurs and, of course, be there as the man who, of course, had started so many of these fantastic retailers that still till today in South Africa survive and, of course, allow for there to be employment. And that is Dr. Christo Wiese. He is, of course, the former PEPCO, former ShopRite chairperson, and, of course, the former Steinhoff chairperson at that also. Well, that comes to a conclusion for our discussion here on the talking point from myself, Faraz Patel, and the rest of the team. We will see you same time, same place next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.